Let's try that again. Good morning. All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. First, thanks to the organizers of the conference, Andra, Alex, and everybody else working behind the scenes to make this happen. Thank you so much for joining the event as well. It's a great pleasure to be here, to be in person to talk about stuff we care about. But I want to talk about something we deal with every single day, which is decisions. Let me start with a question. How many of you, raise your hand, had to make at least one decision already today? Yeah, that's all of us, right? And I'll tell you the first decision you had to make, which is the most difficult decision, which is to wake up. Was that easy? No. And every single day that happens, isn't it? We got to go through that decision. And a few weeks ago, I was traveling with my wife, and I wake up pretty early usually. My day starts about 3:30 a.m. If I'm going to be grumpy, I might as well start early to become grumpy, so I usually wake up early. But that particular night, I went to bed pretty late, close to midnight. And knowing that I don't sleep late and I wake up very early, my wife was very concerned. So she asked the question. She said, as I went to bed late, she said, hey, do you have to wake up in the morning? She really meant, do you want to wake up early in the morning? She left the word early. And my response is, no, but I certainly hope I do wake up. So that's a decision we often have to make, isn't it? So it's like we got to drag ourselves off the bed. And I always say there are two Venkats in this world. And I'm sure you would agree with yourself, right? That's one before the coffee and the one after. And I just transform myself once I have that cup of coffee, but otherwise, I'm pretty grumpy in the mornings. But it's a decisions we have to make continuously. That's what we do. And we do this every day in our lives. We do this every day in our jobs. This is the life we lead. Every minute, every hour, every day, we got to make these decisions. But I want to think about these decisions we often have to make continuously, but that's hard. Some decisions may be really easy, especially the decisions that are made for us rather than we having to make it. But other decisions are pretty hard, and we usually sit there, we go through the emotional things in our mind, we're debating, we're not sure which way we want to go. And sometimes our rational mind kicks in. Other times our emotional mind kicks in. And there's a battle between the devil and the evil in our heads. How do we make those decisions, right? It becomes really hard. But I'm going to say the environment that we live in often makes it harder to make the decisions. And it's a mindset. A lot of times we ask the question, how can I change? And if we are inclined to make the changes, we make the changes. If we are not inclined, we resist the changes to all cost possible. And I'll give you an example of this. This was maybe 25, 30 years ago when I decided to build my first house to live in. And as they were constructing the house, I noticed that the windows that I had wanted to place in the house, in my mind, I used to live in a very warm city back then, and I want to keep the windows open. I found the windows were not operable. They were glass windows, you cannot open them. And I rushed to the builder and said, oh my gosh, the windows are not operable. I thought they can be opened and closed. And the builder said, no, that's the way it is. We cannot change it. And I'm like, this is stupid. It's a window. You should be able to replace it, right? No. And that really bothered me, so I'm a little nervous about building in general. But I'm going to say we really need to have the will to change. And if we don't have the will to change our decisions, it's not going to happen. But I just moved into a new house a few months ago. And I started building this house during the pandemic. And you can imagine how things can be when you're trying to build a house and when the world is shut down and we are trying to really get everything back together. And I was pretty nervous, and I wanted to move into this new house. And that's when I tweeted this about maybe a year or year and a half ago. And I said, those who compare building construction to software development understand neither one of them. So anytime I feel people, hear people, including myself, compare the building to software construction, we tend to assume a lot of things. I was on a flight sitting next to somebody in the airplane, And I wanted to have a small talk, so I turned to this person and said, what do you do for a living? And he said, I'm an architect. And I took a deep breath and I said, pardon me asking, are you an architect or are you a real architect? And he looked at me and said, I don't know the distinction between an architect and a real architect. If you can explain it to me, maybe I'll tell you who I am. I said, well, I work in the software field, and we have the so-called architects. He's like, no, I'm a real architect. And he is in the civil engineering, obviously. And I had a conversation with him to see how things are done in the real architecture compared to what we do in software. But like I said, I wanted to build a house, and we hired an architect. Let me first say, this was the most fantastic real architect. He was amazing. I'm really happy with him for what he did. However, the architect is trying to do things based on the data given to him. And he knows the land we're going to build it on. He knows the slope and what I want to angle the building in, all that information. Later, he said, hey, we're going to build this house for you. Here's the architecture. And he said, to get into the house from the front, you're going to have 3 steps to get in. And I called the architect and said, you know what? I like everything you have done. Everything is meeting my expectation, except for one thing. You need 3 steps to get into the house. I don't want steps to get into the house. I want to be able to walk into the house directly. And I've got my parents who live with me during the summer times. My parents are old. It's hard for mom to go into the building when there are stairs. I'm not going to be young all the time. I'm going to be maybe in a wheelchair one day. I need to drag myself in. And the architect said, no, for how you want to angle the house, the elevation you want to put, you got to have 3 steps to go into the house. I'm like, okay, that's fine. In the garage, can you put a ramp so I can move the wheelchair through the ramp? Or mom and dad can go through the slope. No, you cannot put a ramp. There is city code, there is county code, and a ramp requires a slope, and you cannot change the slope. You don't have enough space in the garage to put it. This is already a 4-car garage, by the way, and he says there's not enough space to put it. So we've had a lot of discussion with them, and finally, what do you say? Fine. Let there be 3 steps to get into the house. Go build it. 6:30 a.m., my wife is getting a phone call, and the builder calls and says, hey, I'm here at the site. We are digging the hole on the ground, and we're going to build the foundation today. And my wife says, oh, thank you so much for calling, but we're not going to be there. Venkat is busy with work, and I've got other things to take care of. So we trust you. Go on. We're not going to be there. And he's like, no. The reason I called is we are beginning to dig the hole, and I've got the guys here who are ready to dig the hole to put the foundation. I was wondering, do you want a 0 entry? She's like, what is a 0 entry? You can walk into the house with no stairs at all. And she's like, oh, thanks for that suggestion, but Venkat worked with the architect for weeks on end, and the architect said you cannot do it. And Dave is like, yeah, that's great, but I'm here with the guys who are digging the hole. Do you want it? Have you ever heard that before? Don't worry what the architect said. I've got the programmers here coding. What do you want to do? And I was blown away by this amazing gentleman. His name is Dave Hammer. And Dave says, we can make the 0 entry. And I'm like, seriously? Yeah, if you're able to do it, go for it. And he calls the architect and says, let me explain to you how we can make the 0 entry. So the architect and the folks digging the hole and him are working together for 2 hours on the day they're digging the hole, redraw the entire plan, change the elevation entirely, resubmit to the county, get their approval, and at 3 o'clock they come back to me and say, here you go, verify this and sign off on this before we continue further. And I went to him one day, and this was just one example. Can you imagine? They are building a house, and they're changing the architecture and the elevation on the day they are digging the hole. And this is just one example of what they did. So I went to Dave and said, Dave, why do you do this? I mean, you could have just said, hey, this is what has been drawn. That's what I'm going to build, right? I'm not going to spend a day on this. increasing the money that I'm going to spend doing it? And Dave gave me a reply that absolutely blew my mind. He said, Venkat, I'm going to build this once, but you're going to live there for a long time. What an idea. And my programmers in the meantime, what do you mean? I already wrote the code. I want to change it. No, I don't want to change it. But the users don't like this. I don't care. I don't want to change the code. I wrote it. What a concept, isn't it? So the will to change is the very first step in making the decision. If we have done something and we don't want to change it, it doesn't matter then. But the minute we say, hey, this is what we did based on what we know, but we can do something better. So we want to come back and revisit it. That little moment, when that thought appears in the mind, everything changes around us. And so in the end, when the construction was done, that's basically what we had eventually. Where the elevation was modified, there were no steps to go into the house. We can just walk in. I can tell you how appreciative I am every time I walk through the door and other places in the house. So that's just an example of how we can even change things where we think it is really expensive to change, but the will to change. But of course, hey, building the house, putting the, doorway, stairs, yeah, those are interesting decisions. But some decisions in life are very highly critical. And I think you will agree with me, like this one. No decision, aha. How many of us, raise your hand, use the over-orientation? Yeah. How many of us, it's okay, you're among friends. It's okay to raise your hand. How many of us use the under-orientation? A few of us, right? Now, it's kind of impolite to ask this question, which one is right? It's the wisdom of crowd, you would say, right? In fact, this is even more scarier to think about it. Because I was like, hey, this is a simple matter, I thought. Then I started Googling a little bit and reading about it. And what I came to know was this: the correct way to hang a paper toilet according to science. And more so, hanging the wrong way can result in absenteeism, people don't show up to work, worker compensation payments, and even business-busting lawsuits. How scary that is, isn't it? And you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize putting in the wrong way could result in a lawsuit and people not going to. Tomorrow you could say, when you show up to work, it was in the wrong place, right? Wrong orientation. But then I was curious, how could it be just one-sided? Of the people who raised the hand, right? There's got to be some reason why they hang it the other way. So I was curious. I started digging in a little bit. Of course, for everything you want to, you look at Wikipedia, right? Everything in Wikipedia is good, obviously. And I came to know that if you have pets in the house, if you have small children in the house, imagine paper rolls rolling around everywhere in the house. You're like, damn it, and you change the orientation, there is peace in the house after that. So there is no right answer, there is no wrong answer. But the problem with these things is now, every time I go into a bathroom, I've got to look at that and say, is it overhanging or underhanging? And surprisingly, in every airport I've been to in the past few weeks, and every lounge I've been in, every airplane I've been in, it's all underhanging. They don't have pets in the airplanes and lounges, but they have a lot of children in there, right? And so they know not to create a mess. So now think about the question, is it after all such an easy decision? It's no-brainer. After all, not. It depends on whether you're a person like me with no children, young children in the house, or you got a lot of little kids and pets running around. You have to make a decision differently. So what it turns out to is that very few things in life are binary choices. It's not obvious. We can convince ourselves it's obvious, but it's not. We have to ask the question, why would you want this? What are the reasons you want something different? What are the pros? What are the cons? If we don't take the time to answer the question, what are the pros and cons, we are missing out on certain things that might be better in a certain situation, but we don't even know to explore it. So very few things in life are binary choices that we can make. So let's think about this for a minute. Ego. Is it good to have ego or not good to have ego? You probably will remember saying, oh my gosh, that guy is terrible. He's egoistic. But imagine somebody with no ego at all. What would that person be like? That would be a person with low self-confidence. No ego. What do you think? I don't know. Is it good? I cannot make a decision. Without ego, we'll be on the floor. We won't even have the courage to wake up and walk around us. What if we do have extreme ego? That is overconfidence, arrogance. We don't listen to anybody, including ourselves. That's terrible, isn't it? What you want is something right in the middle, a good balance. We want self-confidence, but not overconfidence or underconfidence. So is ego good or bad? Ego is like cholesterol. You want some good cholesterol and less of bad cholesterol. Without it, we'll be dead. Either one of them, right? Cholesterol or ego. So is it okay to have ego? Absolutely. But enough of it, but not too much. But let's think about it. How are you? Let me ask you this question. Take a minute, if you will, please. Just turn to the person next to you. Ask them, how are you? Go ahead. Go ahead. Make a noise. Turn around, ask them. Well, you heard a response, right? What did you hear from the person next to you when you asked, how are you? I really hope nobody said, terrible, right? If they say terrible, you're like, why are you, right? Here. So I hope nobody said terrible. Did anyone say, great, awesome? If they did, they're the Americans in the room. That's what we say. You come to us and say, how are you doing? I'm awesome, I'm great. You're like, really? Just tone it down a little bit. But that's what we are. We are awesome, we are great, because why feel otherwise? But are we really awesome and great? Yes, we are, until you ask any more details. Then we start complaining. I was in Sweden a few weeks ago. I was teaching a class for a company over there, and I came into the room, and they said, how are you? I said, I'm great. And they all laughed. I said, is it a problem? They said, no problem. I said, you don't say great, do you? They said, no. I said, what do you then say? They said, we say, they're okay, meaning it's okay. That's a nice balance, right? And this is a philosophy in Swedish that you're not too great, you're not too, down either. You're just right there, enough to keep going. It's a humility, humbleness. I wish I can have that kind of attitude one day, but that's a nice thing to have, a nice balance between the two is a great idea. That's awesome. But are you an optimist? Are you a pessimist? Well, I'm sure there are some people in this room who are eternally optimistic. Some of us are pessimistic. Sometimes we decide which way we want to be. I'm optimistic in some cases, not as much in others. But anyway, I came across this one interesting way of understanding the difference between an optimist and a pessimist. By way of somebody telling me this, they said, a pessimist and an optimist walked into a bar. And the bartender asked the question, how are things? And the pessimist in the group said, it cannot get any worse. And the optimist decided to differ from that opinion. So, is it good to be optimistic or is it good to be pessimistic, right? And the answer is, yeah, there's a balance we have to strike. If you're overly optimistic, we could fall off the cliff, not know. If you're overly pessimistic, we don't leave the house, but we want to be cautious about it. So there is a balance. Should I say yes? Should I say no? And this is one thing we need to really ask ourselves, because fundamentally, we need to think about one thing we have that you will never, ever get back once you spend it: time. So our time is limited. So I get invited to come and give talks. I love talking, and I enjoy meeting people and developers, but I cannot be anywhere and everywhere all the time. So these days, I say no about 70% of the time, because otherwise I cannot just get anything done. But how do you say no? I was talking to my son, who is on the other end of the spectrum. I'm getting towards my retirement. He's just starting his career as a programmer. And he said, Dad, I was asked to do this, and then they asked me to do this. My head is spinning. I said, and what did you do? He said, I said yes to everything. And I said, son, you said yes to everything. And he's like, yes, and I'm looking for more things to say yes. Is he wrong? No, he's pretty smart. He's right. Then I thought to this, and I sat there and thought about it. I keep saying no. He keeps saying yes. Which one of us is right? Both of us are, right? And so the more you say yes, the less you will deliver. This is one of the biggest fallacies in our field. You say, yes, boss, I'll do it. What did you do? Nothing. Why did you do it? I had too many things to do. How did you end up with too many things to do? Because you kept saying yes. So at some point, you have to ask the question, should I say yes? Yes, say yes to. I always tell people, I never tell people I am busy. That's a lie. I don't want to be busy. I say, this is not my priority. That's what I reply. When people say, can you review this book? Can you write this article? My response is, I'm really sorry. This is not my priority. I'm not busy. This is not my priority. This is not important to me where I am compared to other things I want to do. So when it's not my priority, don't tell me make time for it. I'm not going to make time for it. You know why? Because I'm not God. I cannot make time. I can only spend time. And I'm going to prioritize on the time I have. So the question you want to ask is, when you're a novice, by the way, novice is not related to age. I might be experienced. I'm not calling myself an expert. I may be experienced in something. But I'm a novice in a lot of other things. You ask me to go skydiving, I'm the novice. I'm like, oh my gosh, skydiving, what are the best practices? What are the do's and don'ts? When you're a novice versus when you're an expert or experienced, if you will. So you want to gain experience when you're a novice. That's your priority because you don't know a lot of stuff. You want opportunities when you're a novice. Hey, what do you want to do? I want to grow in this company. I want to grow in this business. That's where my son is. He wants experience. He wants opportunity. When you're an expert or experienced, what is your priority at that time? My priority right now is not gaining experience. When somebody calls me and says, we'll give you exposure, I'm like, I don't need one, right? That's the last thing I want. I don't want experience. I've got that. I don't want opportunity. I've got that. What I want is I want to succeed in what I do. That's important to me. I don't want to work on a failed project. I want to work on a project that is successful. What I want is reputation as you gain experience. If I say yes to several things, my reputation goes down because they say, you said yes, well, you didn't even deliver this. We don't want to hire you again. I want to show up on time. I want to get my work done. I want you to say, thanks. We want you to come back and do more work for us. So where does this take us? Say yes eagerly when you're a novice. But as time goes on, you're moving in this direction and begin to say no nicely. Not as a jerk, but in a nice way. Thanks for asking, but no thanks. And this is one thing we should be careful about because in our mind, we play a trick. The other day I was talking to somebody and they said, oh my gosh, are you saying no to this person? I said, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked. It's very important to keep this in mind. You're not saying no to the person. You're saying no to the task. That separation in our mind makes a big difference. I tell my boss comes to me and says, I've got an idea. No. Not to you, but to the task. I like you. We can go have lunch together. I'm working on things you gave me last week. I cannot finish that if I take more from you. And what I've realized from people is when I say no to them nicely, they are a little bit unhappy with me. But they are very happy when I deliver the results to them. On the other hand, when I say yes, they're very happy at the moment, and they're very unhappy when I cannot deliver. And I always tell the people I work with, I got a choice. I got to make you happy at some point and unhappy at some point. But you get to decide. Do you want to be unhappy now and happy later? Or do you want to be happy now and unhappy later? Your choice. I cannot make everybody happy all the time. So that is a choice we have to make in doing so. So as you gain experience, you want to say more, no more often, and then your novice say yes more often. So, and that shift has to happen at some point in time so we can make the decision when we want to balance between the reputation we can gain to the opportunities we can have as well. That shift has to happen over time. So it's neither one nor the other that we need to think about. Well, living is an act of evaluating trade-offs. That's what we've been talking about so far, isn't it? It's a trade-off. Which is right? Here are benefits to this, and here are the cons to it. It's a trade-off we have to evaluate. Every single thing in life is a trade-off. I'm happy, I'm thankful you are here, which means you're not in many other places. That's a trade-off you decided to evaluate. And that's a choice we have to make as well. You can rarely decide which is better in isolation. We tend to really think about this in good or bad, good or evil. It doesn't work that way. It's a holistic view rather than being in isolation. And when we think about holistic rather than in isolation, we tend to make decisions very differently. So the first and foremost is to think of decisions not as a switch on the wall. You go to the wall, flip it on, flip it off. That's not decisions. Decisions are more dials that you are controlling rather than switches you turn on and turn off. To make things worse, they're not just dials, they are interconnected dials. You turn one dial this way, another dial goes that way. And you're like, oops. And you turn that this way, this turns this way. Now you're trying to say, how do I bring them together? So here's an interesting thing to think about. I want scalability. Great. It's scalable or not? I want performance. Great. To have performance or not? But here's the unfortunate situation. If you increase performance to the extent you can, your scalability goes down. You increase scalability to the maximum extent, your performance goes down. You cannot have both most of the time. I said most of the time because somebody says, I've got both. I said, really? How did you get that to that point? Our system cost $1 billion. He's like, yeah. So the cost went up. And who can spend that kind of money? The government can, because they don't spend their own money. It's easier. But nobody else, nobody else can do this. I worked with a client recently. They get funding from the government. I really wish I found them sooner, because working with them was like Christmas every day. The first day I joined them, I asked them, how many cores does this machine have? Every question gets an answer with a follow-up question, which I love from them. I said, how many cores does this machine have? They said, why? This machine has only 1,000 cores, but if you need more, please let us know. I'm like, where have you been? And I said, how much memory does this machine have? They were worried. They said, this machine only has 1 terabyte of main memory. But if you need something more, please let us know. I'm like, this is great. Bring it on, right? It's like Santa Claus sitting next to you every day. But most of us cannot afford that. So we have to think about this as, here is a range I want in terms of scalability. Poor scalability, high scalability. Here's a range I want. Good performance, poor performance. But your goal is to find something in between. You got to find something in between in this range while you can be within that range. How can you really balance these two out so you can have enough performance and enough scale so you can balance them together? Now you're not looking at, I want this, I don't want that. How can I compromise to get that? Well, that brings up the question. This is my backyard from my house, filled with snow only a few weeks ago. And we have had an extremely cold temperature. This is out in Colorado, where I live. And you can imagine, I literally live in an ice box, so to say. The temperature was so low, it was incredible even to step out for a few minutes. You just freeze up right away. I was telling a friend of mine, the temperature was minus 20 degrees. But with the wind chill, it was minus 35, I said. The only thing my friend could ask at the time was, excuse me, was it Celsius or Fahrenheit? Does it matter when it's freaking cold? And I was curious, and I found out at minus 40, it's the same, by the way. Minus 40 centigrade is the same as minus 40 Fahrenheit, which is equivalent to hell. Basically, that's what it was. And so, obvious question is, how do you stay warm, Venkat? I got children coming from college, and they are home for the holidays. And what do they say? Mom, Dad, it's too cold here. I'm like, welcome back home. Can we turn up the heat, please? And I tell my children, yeah, we can turn up the heat. Yeah, that would be really nice if you can please turn up the heat. Guess what happens if we turn up the heat? It's very comfortable for the children, but very uncomfortable for my wallet. My electricity bill just goes through the roof, right? Energy bill. And now I tell my children, but the energy bill is too high. And they're like, but it's too cold. And I tell them, no problem. Why don't you pay part of the bill? And they're like, do we have more shirts in the house? Now we are thinking very differently, right? Because when they have to pay for it, and if you ever come to my house, you would look at me and say, where's Venkat? Because I am under 6 pairs of clothing. I put on 6 layers of clothing. This is very comfortable for the wallet and for me as well. So the reality is really this, isn't it? I can turn up the heat, which is great. I'm comfortable. And when the bill comes in, I'm very uncomfortable. So now what am I asking? What temperature can I keep the house in when with enough clothing I feel comfortable and I'm paying enough electricity bill, energy bill, but not to the point where we become unhealthy, but not to the point where we end up burning more fuel. Now it is a trade-off again. And when my children are asked to pay for it, they very quickly understand trade-off. This is one thing my wife and I have learned over time. We made our children pay for their bills from very early on. When they want to buy their shoes, we never bought them shoes. They had an allowance every month. They got a money on their hand. And they had to go do the shopping themselves with the money they have. Now we never had a debate what shoe to buy. Hey, it's your shoes, go buy it. And they're like, I can't afford it. Yeah, neither can we. So you can decide it differently, right? So we tend to think differently when we realize there are trade-offs. Now it's not about the best shoes I can wear so I can show off to my colleagues in my school. I need to really buy one that is worthy of it for the money we spend. We are thinking about trade-offs. So trade-offs really quickly come in. Similarly, should I spend my money right now? Should I save it? If I spend my money, I can have all these wonderful things with me. How cool that is. I can live in the comfort. But what happens when I retire, when I don't work anymore? I'm going to save like crazy. Well, what do you do for what you do now? I can't buy clothes. It's a balance we have to strike. So every day, that's a trade-off. Should I spend today? Should I save today? And there are times in life I would spend more. There are times in life I spend less. I am the stingiest person I know. You ask me to go buy a shirt, I'll be debating for 50 hours. And then I order a computer. And my wife is like, really? He's like, yeah. That's $4,000. Yeah, but did you see the power that it has? I don't spend as much time in my clothes as I do on my computer. So that's where I invest my time and money into it, right? It's a balance you strike. It's a trade-off. So you have to really think about, you spend more, you have less to save. You save more, you have less to spend. That's a trade-off we have to decide every single day. But as humans, it's really hard. You go to somebody who is in 20s and say, when you retire, they're like, what are you talking about? That's a long time away. It's not tangible. So it's hard to think about those days when we won't work. And that's one of the things that gets us a lot into trouble. This takes us to an interesting problem that we often face, which is, where should we focus on? Your boss tells you, get it done, get it done, get it done. Are you done yet? Are you done yet? Well, I want to write code with quality. Don't worry about it. Ship it. We got to get this out tomorrow because it was due yesterday. We live in this field of hypocrisy where we want to keep shipping things very quickly. So Toyota, at one point, did what's called local optimization. They spent a lot of money on producing their cars, but their maintenance cost was really high. And they realized if they put a little bit more effort into manufacturing quality, yes, look at that, they're spending more money on it, more time on it, but suddenly they found they're spending less on maintenance. So when you look at local optimization, you look very differently. How can I cut cost here? But when you look at global optimization, then you tend to think about it very differently. So as a company, as an organization, we need to look at the overall cost, not just the cost of one little thing we do. This really goes back to what Toyota was talking about, is the system. The system is summarized in 14 principles, but the very first one, base your management decision on long-term philosophy, even at the expense of short-term financial goals. Now, this takes courage to think about it this way. Even if I'm going to suffer in the short term, I'm going to think about the long-term benefits of what we are going to get. I wish more of us will have that in our mind, in our industry. So my recommendation is survive in the short term, but succeed in the long term. Because if you don't think about long-term success, what good is in succeeding in the short term and incurring a long-term failure? So we want to always think about that long term, because the long term eventually becomes the time that we have to live in, and we have to keep thinking about it. So be sustainable. That becomes essential. So living, I mentioned, is really an act of evaluating trade-offs. That's about life. But guess what? Programming is how we make our living. A lot of us in this room, we write software to make a living. This is our life as a programmer every day that we have to deal with. So the evolution of software development, once upon a time, we had waterfall development. What is the problem with waterfall? What is wrong with waterfall? I would say there's nothing wrong with waterfall. It was fine for what it did, except for one small detail. In the waterfall development, you start designing software. You do requirements analysis. You do analysis. You design. Then eventually you start coding. When you start coding, something happens that never happened before. You know what that is, right? When you write code, you can compile it. When you compile code, you can run it. When you run code, you can see it. And when you see it, you realize that's not what we wanted. And when you realize it, notice I've come this far, and you are here, and you don't have much time, much space left. That moment in time is called panic. The problem with waterfall is the feedback comes way too late. That's the problem. And when the feedback comes late, we don't have enough time to change things. When we don't have enough time, our mind messes up, we get really anxious, we get panicky, we throw things together, accelerates much bigger failure. Of course, the world is a different place today, isn't it? We don't do waterfall, we don't do big upfront development. We are agile. What does that mean? That means no design. This is having fun. Hey, how do you do this? Don't worry about it, we are agile. How do you plan? Don't worry about it, we are agile. What does that mean? That's a disaster in the making as well. A lot of people still do waterfall development. They call it agile development because it feels good. I go to companies and they say, Venkat, thanks for coming. We are agile. I say, I'm so glad we got that out of the way. Now let's talk about what you actually do. And they're not doing agile development. They say, we want to do agile. I'm like, no, you don't do agile. Nobody does agile. You be agile. Agile is not what you do. Agile is how you live. It is nothing to do with software development. It's feedback-driven development. That's what it really is. So what do we know in this case? We know plan design doesn't work. We failed at it. And guess what? Emergent design doesn't work. We fail at it too. So what we need is a balance. What we need is an evolutionary approach where we do enough design and evaluate it. But if we don't really focus our effort on doing so, how can we get the results? There's design by contract. A lot of us are used to it. If you're building a software where you are using statically typed languages, that's what you're doing. Building with a contract, interface, and everything that put together. Design by capability in a dynamic type language, for example. Now, again, there's a trade-off here. If you look at a language which is statically typed, you got fewer runtime errors. That's great, isn't it? You got compiler checks. That's awesome. You got conformance. This is what languages like Java, C#, Scala, all those languages provide for us. What about Python? What about Ruby? What about JavaScript? Well, those are dynamically typed. They give us the flexibility to do what is called design by capability. You don't ask for conformance on an interface. You simply say, hey, look, if you have this capability, come on in and let's use it. That is another set of trade-offs that you get. Which one is right? I spent my years on this side. It was hard to cross over, scary to go over. And once I did, I embraced other ways of writing software, and I saw the benefits of being in this area. Today, I'm back and forth, depending on the projects I'm working on. I have to say I've written more production code in this area, honestly, than there in my experience. But it took me a while to transition over. Think about this like building a car. Do I want to build a car with steel? Oh, yeah, everything is a steel. Tires are steel. Seats are steel. No, you wouldn't build a car like that. Why not? Because it'll be really painful to be on the road with it. So there are soft parts in your car, and there are hard parts in your car. That's what makes this usable. There are parts that flex, like spring, not the framework, but the real spring. So you're able to use these things to get the flexibility, if you will. And so as a result, you get malleability built in. A guy named Ola Binney talks about this as a language pyramid. He says when you're building an enterprise system, you want to think about a stable layer, you want to think about a dynamic layer, and you want a domain-specific layer. As it turns out, different language capabilities play a role in different areas. Not one language is going to be useful for all of these. You want more malleability on the top. You want more conformance and compliance in the bottom. You want a mixture of those in building your applications. So you want to really think about what languages may be suitable for building each of these different layers. Hey, what about design principles? We talk about solid principles. We want to think about them and use them as well. Quick question, is reuse useful? Yeah, right? We want reusability, no doubt about it. Hey, what about coupling? Should we have increased coupling or decreased coupling? What do you think? Decreased coupling, right? That we want less coupling, absolutely. Hey, what about duplication? Should we do more duplication or less duplication? Less, of course. These are easy things to answer, right? Now, let's think about it. You put dry and reuse on one side, you put coupling on one side, and suddenly we have a little problem to think about. What happens? If you have low coupling, you have low reuse, and maybe more duplication. But if you increase your coupling, you get more reuse. By nature, if you're reusing something, you got to depend on it. Coupling goes up. So now we are asking, which is better? It's a dial. Do I want to favor reuse? But wait a minute, the coupling went higher. Lower my coupling. Okay, now I got to reduce my reuse. Which is the balance I should strike? Hard question. When I'm emotionally attached to the principles, I'm going to fight with you. If you wake me up one day and say, we will, yeah, so he's already angry, right? So if you are trying to increase, if I say, hey, reduce, reuse, you're like, oh my gosh, are you crazy? But wait a minute, we're increasing the coupling. That increases the cost of development. I'll talk about a story of a company I work with. This is a large insurance company in the US. I cannot mention their name. I was working with them, sitting next to a programmer. I shouldn't have asked this question, but I did. And I really wish he said, don't go there. But he didn't stop. I asked him, this class, I want to see the table in the database that represents it. He said, sure. And he opens the table. And I'm looking at it in a state of shock. He's kind of calm and quiet. I said, this table, it has 800 columns. This database has 1,000 tables. And every table has hundreds and hundreds of columns. Who uses it? Everybody. I said, what do you mean everybody? He looked at me and said, you understand we are an enterprise? I said, yes. So all the enterprise applications use it. Can you imagine working in this company? There is a database with thousands of tables where tables contain hundreds of columns. I want you to think about this. Can you think of the schema? And if you change the schema, what's going to happen? You break the entire damn enterprise. You probably have seen this. You go for an interview with this company, you're talking to people, they said, hey, let's continue the interview, but let's go to lunch. So they take you to lunch, and they say, we got a great cafeteria. And you're like, this is great. And you're having a good time talking to them. And you're thinking, maybe I should come to work for this company. And you're looking out of the room, people having a great time. You're like, this is awesome. During lunchtime, everybody's happy and vibrant. And then you look, and in the corner, away from everybody, there's one person spacing the wall and sitting and eating alone. And you said, who is that person? They said, we don't talk about this person. Like, oh, what happened? He tried to change the schema 3 weeks ago. And he's on timeout for 3 months now, right? Nobody talks to him. So if you ask this company, how is business? There's only one thing they tell you when into the company, right? What do they tell you in the morning when you come in? They tell you, don't screw up. Because if you screw up, the entire business comes crushing down. And your business analyst, very enthusiastic, comes in, I got an idea. What do you want? I want to make this one change for the business. And you're like, no problem. Come back in 3 months. Like, one change. Okay, maybe 4 months. Why? You don't understand software development. We got to go talk to the schema team first. We got to get their approval first. They will take 2 months to make the change. And they got to make sure nothing ever breaks. What happened in this process? Unfortunately, code stability takes over business agility. You cannot survive as a business in this field. This is one of the trade-offs we often face when it comes to microservices, for example. If you only focus on reuse, you are focusing on you, the programmer. The business doesn't care about what you can do. The business cares, can we move faster? Can we make changes? So the question is not how we throw what we do. The question is, how do we accommodate what the business wants and yet survive in the short term? That's the question we want to ask. So same thing with encapsulation. If you increase encapsulation, you decrease reuse. You increase reuse, you reduce encapsulation. Which one is more important to you? The answer is not clear anymore. Because if I think about the business needs, I got to think about this very differently in evaluating. If I'm only a purist, I keep chanting, reuse is important, dry is important, encapsulation is important, yes, but how do you give them all together? You cannot. It's a trade-off. You dial this way, that dials that way. What is the middle ground I have to strike to be able to accommodate it? So we're not saying duplicate with vengeance. What we are saying is reduce duplication, but prioritize encapsulation to provide better business agility. So you got to ask the question, what is your objective? What is it that you want to really focus on? I'm not going to work to write software. I go to work to deliver software. Writing is part of the delivery. If I'm not able to deliver at the end of the day after writing it, what good is writing? So focus on the business. So evaluate trade-offs continuously, because that's what we do for a living, is we evaluate trade-offs. And should I use imperative or functional programming? Again, the same problem, the conundrum. People look at this and say, oh my gosh, this is not good in performance. I cannot tell you how many emails to respond to every week. I want to write functional code, but it doesn't perform very well. Well, I'm sorry, but what are your motives? What are you focusing on? Do you really want that raw performance? Imperative gives you raw performance, but that's not what I'm after all the time. I'm interested in maintainability of the code. Can I increase performance by parallelizing the code a lot better? That's a question I want to ask as well. So you have maintainability on one hand, performance on the other. If you can make it more performant, it's hard to maintain sometimes. You make it easier to maintain sometimes, it may not give the performance. What's the balance to strike? Scalability and performance, similarly. It's a trade-off you may want to strike. But don't ask, is the code fast? I cannot tell you how many times I have this discussion. I want the code to be fast. For what? Why? So the question is the code fast? That's a terrible question. What you want to ask is the speed adequate? If the speed is adequate for my needs, then I can have other benefits. The code is fast enough, easier to maintain. That's very important to ask the question. Recently, I was in a company when a programmer walked in, sat with a third, very angry. I said, having a frustrating day at work, isn't it? And he looked at me and said, I love Python. And I saw these people write terrible Python code. I'm angry looking at their code. I said, it's okay, I understand. What happened? And they wrote all this nasty code, and they said they did it for getting performance. And he looked at me and said, what do you think of that? I said, does it have good performance? He said, that's the problem, it doesn't. So those who compromise, so the end result of worrying about performance often is the worry, not the performance. You didn't get the performance at the end. What you are left with is a worry of worrying about it. And those who sacrifice quality to get performance may end up getting neither. That's one of the problems we have to deal with. So now the code is so messed up, we can't even improve it. When we actually want to improve it, that becomes a problem. So ask the question, if performance is really important, write tests for it and evaluate the trade-off. And of course, designing and architecting is evaluating trade-offs. And as long as when we make decisions and think about this trade-off, we think very differently. So identify the essential characteristics you need to deal with. Prioritize what is really important for your goals, design and architecture. And then evaluate the trade-offs as you implement them. And don't make binary decisions, because they almost never give us the results we want. So decision-making is an optimization problem. That's what it really is. There's no one answer. You're trying to come up with multiple answers and select what is better of those answers. It is an optimization problem, and we have to constantly evaluate it. So decision-making is an act of considering compromises and willing to compromise. So what is the most important thing you can ever document? It is the why. Because if you don't document the reasoning, we're going to keep going over it over and over and over. That's of no use. And let's be honest about it. What is the most sensible answer we can also give? It depends. Hope that was useful. Thank you.